All right, hello everyone. My name is Shea and welcome to my senior TED Talk. Today we're going to be exploring the sustainability of salmon fisheries around the world and some of the issues plaguing these areas. First, I want you to imagine salmon and just think about it. Do you think about nothing? Or do you think about maybe the dinner on a rich man's plate? For me personally, I think of a wriggling fish in a net. But in the future, we may be thinking of salmon in the past tense. This is a visual representing salmon in the year 1900, roughly 100 years ago. And since then, there have been a number of issues plaguing salmon. To the modern day, where there are now roughly 10 salmon per 100 salmon left, they've declined by 90% since the year 1900. And this is huge. This has led me to pose the research question of what are the factors influencing the sustainability of salmon fisheries, and how can regions improve or increase positive factors to mitigate and to nullify these factors and to positively influence populations of salmon around the world. This has a very personal importance to myself because I was born in Alaska and I grew up there as well as in Durango. I go back every summer and I commercially salmon fish with members of the community. I've seen the impact it has on people's lives, and I've seen the impact it has on my own life. And I wouldn't want to rob this experience from anyone, or the culture from many of these groups in Alaska and other parts of the world. But besides personal importance, salmon also have a very high value to other areas of the world. For many indigenous cultures, salmon are a reliable food source, in addition to being very culturally valuable and important, representing the renewal of life as they come back every year. In addition to indigenous cultures, salmon also pose a very high monetary value. They create a multi-billion-dollar industry stretching across multiple countries in the Northern Hemisphere. And in addition to this, employ tens of thousands of people all across the world in commercial fishing, in canneries, and in salmon farming and aquaculture. Now, the final and probably the most important impact of salmon is their effect on the environment. Salmon are a link between the inland areas of the world and the oceans. They bring nutrients from the ocean back into the rivers and deposit them to nourish the environments there. But there are a number of issues affecting salmon. The first of which is dams and how they impede the movement of salmon. The second is salmon farms and how they can spread disease and cause other issues genetically with salmon. The third is irresponsible fishing, which I've umbrellaed into overfishing and illegal fishing. And the fourth is climate change, and specifically how climate change is warming up rivers and oceans around the world. The first of these issues is dams, and primarily how dams impede the movement of salmon. Salmon are an anadromous species of fish, meaning that they start their life cycle in the fresh waters of rivers and streams and then travel out into the ocean. Once they're in the ocean, they grow big and fat and then come back into the rivers, travel up to their natal streams, and spawn again. This creates a cycle. But these dams in the way impede the movement, and even having just one dam can really mess up the salmon's life cycle, causing them to have delayed time or not reach their spawning grounds at all. This creates most of the conflict between dams and the salmon around the world. One of the first places that I studied while researching dams was Penobscot River in Maine. On this river system, there was a study done, and they found that for every dam along a river, the survivability of a salmon decreased by 6%. And this is massive, because many of these rivers have upwards of 10 or more dams. They found that in total, on the Penobscot River, the effect of dams on the salmon survivability was roughly 37%, which is massive. And all of this is far more important when you consider that many of these dams have upwards of 10 or more dams on the rivers. For example, the Columbia River in Oregon has 470 dams on it, blocking off much of the river to salmon and their spawning grounds. Actually, this has come to a head in the fact that there is only one natural spawning ground for wild king salmon left on the entirety of the Columbia River basin, and has caused a massive drop in their population. Now, I want to draw a comparison between the Columbia River and the Penobscot River in Maine. In Alaska, they're the largest US state there are very few dams, roughly 100 in the entire state. And this has partially led to why Alaska has some of the largest salmon runs in the entire world. There aren't any blockages in the river to impede their life cycle. And actually, that study on the Penobscot River found that a river with no dams on it has a rough 87% chance of survival for each smolt on the river, which seems more in line with the natural world. Now, this brings up a lot of solutions. It seems that the removal of dams is the best way to protect salmon, and that's pretty correct. The removal of dams paired with the cleanup of many of the rivers can result in the flourishing and the renewal of many salmon runs around the world. For example, on the Connecticut River in Connecticut, there was a cleanup effort put up by a conservation group where they cleaned up the river and then removed the dams. And the Connecticut River, which used to have no salmon running on it, now has a pretty reliable salmon run of 100 to 600 fish per year, which doesn't seem like a lot in comparison to Bristol Bay's 74 million this year, but it's still something. Now, one of the main pushbacks against the removal of dams is their electrical generation ability. And this is a huge deal because removing people's electricity in many of these areas, like the Pacific Northwest, would be unacceptable. But a study in New England found that roughly 1,500 dams in just New England alone are dilapidated, out of use, and serve no purpose except for blocking salmon and stopping them from migrating. So there's been a lot of efforts in these areas to remove the dams that aren't in use anymore and that would be impeding salmon's processes and movement. This is an example of the Elwha Dam where they removed it and the salmon are able to run there again. But why are salmon still being affected in areas that maybe don't have as much of an impact from dams? This brings me into the second issue facing salmon in today's world, salmon farms. Now, a salmon farm consists of a large pen suspended in the water containing thousands and even tens of thousands of fish. These fish are in close proximity and produce a massive amount of waste. So many aquaculturists and salmon farmers have come up with a solution of moving the pens into areas of deep, swift-moving water where the waste can be moved and spread out, because this waste is very toxic to the fish and the surrounding environment. Unfortunately, this also happens to be the same place that wild salmon like to congregate, in these deep, swift-moving waters. And this creates the main conflict between salmon farming and salmons, and wild salmon. The first of these issues is salmon lice. Now, this louse is a naturally occurring parasite on salmon, and sometimes accumulates in 1s, 2s, and even 3s on a fish. But these fish are very spread out and travel far distances in small numbers. So these lice can't accumulate in very big amounts. Unfortunately, in these salmon farms, the fish are in close proximity, enclosed in a very small environment. So these lice are able to accumulate in massive amounts in these swarms of fish, of parasites, that can devour entire fish. In fact, in Norway, the salmon farming there has reported that roughly 25% of an entire pen can be devoured purely by salmon lice. And this causes untold economic loss to many of these areas. In addition to this, the sea lice, when they accumulate in these large areas, are able to branch out and jump from the pens to nearby wild fish. And in fact, in areas like Scotland, they've reported that the wild salmon populations around areas with salmon farms are actually far lower than the areas without them. The second issue surrounding salmon farms is escapements and the weaker genetics of farmed and domesticated salmon. So an escapement occurs when the pen breaks open and some of these fish get out. And this is a huge issue because when these salmon breed with wild fish in the Atlantic and the Pacific, they can create a stock of fish that is far less fit than the wild counterparts. And this is an issue. For example, in the Faroe Islands in Norway, roughly 30% of the wild commercial salmon catch there is in fact escaped farm salmon from Scotland. And all of this came to a head in 2017 in Washington, when a pen in the San Juan Islands in Puget Sound broke open during a solar eclipse when the tides were especially strong. And 150 to 250,000 Atlantic salmon escaped into the Pacific Ocean in Puget Sound and quickly made their way into the streams of Washington. Fortunately, these fish are they don't have as high of a survival instinct or survivability as the Pacific salmon there, so they were most likely outcompeted, and all of them have died since then. But it still causes a scare in Washington, and they have banned salmon farming to be phased out by the year 2026. But I don't think that banning salmon farms is a solution. Many others point to moving salmon farms inland to these larger facilities where the salmon would be isolated away from their wild counterparts and wouldn't have the risk of these sea lice. The sea lice wouldn't be there in the first place, so they wouldn't be able to impact them in the same way economically. And in addition to that, there wouldn't be as many escapements because, as far as I know, salmon can't walk on land. But there's been a lot of pushback against this because it would be expensive and have very high upfront cost to many aquaculturists to move their salmon farms inland. An investment in new technologies and the physical infrastructure to be able to move the fish is massive. But it is a very great solution for the economic and ecological impacts of salmon farming. Now, the third issue that I researched was irresponsible fishing, which consists of overfishing and illegal fishing. And there's a quote by Darwin that states, "A large stock of individuals relative to the number of its enemies is absolutely necessary for the survival of the species," and this has not occurred in many areas like Europe. In Europe, there has been too much technological advancement in the way of fishing to be able to catch the most salmon possible, and there is not a large enough relative population to the number of their enemies or their ability to catch fish in Europe, and many of them got extinct in areas such as Germany and France and parts of England. Now, this is a very historic view, though it is still occurring today. There is a far more modern and relevant issue going on in Kamchatka, or the Kamchatka Peninsula in Siberia within Russia in the Pacific Ocean. And Kamchatka and Siberia in total has one of the largest, if not the largest, salmon runs in the entire world. Because of this, the Russian government has imposed many restrictions and laws around the fishing of salmon there, but there's been a lot of pushback from the local fishermen, and they've formed literal mafias to collect salmon illegally. They're primarily going after the roe or the salmon eggs because they can fetch far higher prices than the full meat of the salmon. And these do go for a lot of money. Even children working in these mafias can make upwards of $20,000 in one summer, which is huge, and de-incentivizes or nullifies many of the restrictions and fines the Russian government has put on. Because if you're caught illegally fishing, they just put a fine on you, and then you can just go back out catching illegal fish, and you make more money than the fines would impose on you. So the balance is out of whack there, and people are still able to make money. But despite fines not working in Kamchatka, I think that they are, and many scientists still agree, that they are a good way to prevent the illegal fishing and overfishing of salmon. For example, in Alaska, if you're caught illegally fishing, they would remove your entire catch and impose a large fine on you. And this is basically cut down on all illegal fishing there. But overall, the solutions to overfishing and irresponsible fishing are a very individual and personal choice to everyone, as well as a community. People need to agree and to think about the future of salmon and to protect them on purpose. Now, this may seem like a very naive and overly optimistic view, but it is happening. In Kamchatka, where these mobs are forming to illegally fish salmon, there have been many of the mobsters or mafia men leaving the industry because they know how they are impacting salmon. They know how they are damaging the salmon populations there and want to protect them for the future generations. So a lot of them are leaving the industry and finding jobs elsewhere. And I think this is a great example of people coming together and making personal choices to protect salmon, which is something that needs to be done. Now, this leads me into the final and probably the most impactful issue facing salmon, climate change, and specifically how climate change is affecting and warming up the oceans around, not the oceans, how climate change is affecting and warming up the snowpack, causing it to melt earlier, and warming up the rivers later on in the summers when salmon are running. Now, when the snowpack melts early in the year, the salmon don't have that cold water that they need to survive later on in the summers when they run. And this causes them to hold over in these eddies, waiting for colder water to come by. And sometimes this never happens, and sometimes it does. But while they're in these eddies, they have to burn massive amounts of fat to keep them alive, and this fat is required for them to get farther into the river. Because many salmon, actually salmon do not eat once they enter the stage of their life back into the rivers, so it's all the fat that they've collected from the ocean. And when this happens, and they burn the fat early, they aren't able to get as far into the rivers and die early, causing massive declines and massive mortality among the salmon populations in many areas of the world. In fact, many scientists agree that because of this reason, salmon in California and New England will be extinct within the next 100 years. Extinct within the next 100 years. And this is most likely unavoidable, but there are still a couple of solutions that we can impose to protect northern stocks of salmon, such as the ones in Alaska or Russia and northern Europe. These salmon can still be protected if humans can reduce their emissions, clean up the rivers, and find a way to lower the temperature of the planet, protecting the rivers and their cold waters. This would create a more sustainable and beneficial planet for everyone, and would allow salmon to run again. A world with fish would be beautiful. The streams would run wild with swarms of salmon, and the cycle between the land and the sea would continue, providing nutrients from the ocean into the land and nutrients from the land into the ocean. The world would be a more beneficial place, and salmon would be able to survive for future generations. Thank you.